My twin brother killed a Bigfoot in the winter of 1977. He told me, only me, about the events of the day and all that led to him pulling the trigger. It wasn't a fantastic story a man invents to gain attention because no one knows about it. And even though our father and I knew that he had killed a strange creature, all the details were taken to his grave. Only then did I discover what he had actually done. It is a true story, and I've seen the proof, but I didn't have the proof in my hand until after my brother was killed in an automobile crash in 1999. He wrote the account with a pencil in a composition notebook. His wife remembers him working on the manuscript for days. She would walk in the kitchen while he labored over his writing, and he would slam the notebook shut, staring straight ahead at the wall while she poured a glass of water or wiped the stove down. For a solid week, she had little conversation with him during the evening when their routine was to talk about the day and the kids and the farm and everything else they knew about current events. His secrecy made her uncomfortable because no other facet of his life was this way. He closed the composition book for the last time after 6 evenings of furious writing. The next day it was deposited in a lockbox at the bank. Upon returning home from the bank, he gave his wife the key to the box and had her sign the appropriate paper giving her access, and he told her the notebook should not be opened unless he was dead, and even then it should only be given to his brother. He assured his wife that there were reasons for the secrecy, that she was better off not knowing. Everyone was safer not knowing. Over the years, they would store other valuable papers in the box. His wife, having access, opened the box many times as land was bought and sold, children were born, but never once did she open the notebook. He knew she wouldn't open it, and if she did, he knew that she would count it as a joke on her. No one would believe it, but she never looked, and it lay at the bottom of the box for 22 years. Words in a notebook are not proof that a mythical creature exists or was killed. The story he told our father and me that night in 1977, while we sat sipping bourbon on his front porch, had always been a story to me. The story was told from a broad and general perspective. We believed him, or we believed him as best as we could. There was no question he had killed something big. He was my twin, after all, and I knew him, and we grew in the same womb together. There was never a lie either of us couldn't sniff out the minute it was told. No, the proof is not in a written account of something like this. The instructions he left for me in the manuscript is where the proof lied. And here is his story. Our father was a man of learning. After earning his degree from a public school, he went to a large university on scholarship to earn his master's and then a PhD. He accomplished all this by the age of 29, all the while working to support his family. It was not an easy task for a young black man in those days. In the mid-1940s, after an honorable discharge from the Army, he landed a job in Chicago as an instructor at a local public college. We heard stories about him teaching classes, rushing to his own classes across town, and then coming home to study until late at night. This went on for years until he accomplished his academic goals. In 1944, 2 strong, hungry twin boys were added to the family, putting more weight to the wagon that he was pulling. My mother said he never complained and she never went without anything she needed to raise their family. When we were 7 years old, my father moved us to Mississippi. He had been offered a job at a black college in the north part of the state. My mother didn't like the idea of moving to the state, but he persuaded her that it was a good move for them. Plus, my father had family there. Apparently, it was a good move because he and my mother never left. The move was fun for my brother and I. We were accustomed to the city. This new place looked and felt nothing like the neighborhood we left in Chicago. We could run wild and my mother wouldn't worry about us. My father's aunties and cousins lived close by in the country. We got to know them all and spent most of our summers and days off at their farm. Hunting and fishing were normal activities for this family, and we went with them every chance we could. My brother and I learned how to run rabbit dogs, catch and clean catfish and brim. We loved it all so much that when he and I were old enough and had jobs, we bought their farm. Kids grew up and the family scattered after that. We still keep in touch with some of them. We became farmers. It was a long and hard process to learn how to be successful. It took years and a few night jobs to get by, but we finally got the hang of it. 2 houses were eventually built and 2 families settled into farming life. It was a good life for us. On a cool fall evening in 1977, my brother called the house looking for me. All our beans and cotton were in and sold. It was the time of year that we looked after our livestock. Inflation was rampant during the mid-70s and beef prices were up. We tried our best to increase our small herd through breeding and sold them as fast as we could while prices were high. On that night, I was out helping birth a calf. My brother was deer hunting that evening. There weren't many deer in those days, but my brother had seen a monster buck before the season started, and he was hot after that deer all week. I vaguely remember hearing him shoot that afternoon and hoped he had killed that big deer. I arrived home after dark. My wife told me he was looking for me, and after cleaning up and eating a cold supper, I walked over to his house. He and our father sat on the swing together. The soft glow of the yellow porch light gave a warm sense to the chilly night air. Our father being there wasn't unusual. He loved coming out to the farm, seeing the grandchildren, and hearing all things about farming and cows and tractors. He loved that his sons had chosen this life. I expected them both to give me some banter about something silly, and that was the usual greeting, but their mood seemed to be one of a serious nature. I sat in a chair across from them both. My brother told us the events of that evening. He wrung his hands in nervous tension as he told us the highlights of the shooting. Our father and I never said a word. The story was hard to comprehend. My brother was worried. We couldn't understand why. He had only killed an animal, albeit a strange animal none of us were familiar with. I was confused with his dilemma until he said that the creature looked like a man, or it seemed like a man. His confusion was more complex than mine. "What'd you do with the body?" I asked. "It's taken care of," he said. "Well, tomorrow it'll be taken care of." He hadn't done anything with the carcass. What do you do with something like that? It was big and unnatural. My brother was used to harvesting and butchering his kills, but to him this thing was a varmint, maybe something left to rot on the forest floor. We offered to go to the woods and get it with him, but he refused. He didn't want us involved, and I didn't understand why. He and I had spent 90% of our time together since we were born. We did everything together. That night, our father and I listened to my brother. There was a reason he didn't want us involved. And though we didn't grasp his concern as we sat below that porch light, we knew he had thought this through. I suppose if it had been another situation, we would have insisted that he not do whatever he had worked out in his mind alone. But that night, our intuition was screaming for us to leave this be, to let him deal with it. I didn't see him the next day until dusk. The lights of our small tractor lit the field that ran up to the barn as he slowly creeped the tractor into its stall. With the tractor now under a roof and in its place, he walked the short distance to his back porch, walked inside and closed the door. He never acknowledged me. I saw the porch light go out, so I walked inside too. I slept fitfully that night, worried he was in over his head, that something had snapped with him. As things go that we worry about, I was concerned with something that had no merit, because the next day he was back to normal. Life went on, and my brother didn't mention it again to me or our father. Though we wanted to ask more questions, we knew better. We left it be. I never thought much about the event again until the spring of 1999. The call that every family member dreads came that spring night. My brother had driven to Memphis to pick up seed and fertilizer. The spring was here, and the fields had been turned over, and it was planting season. I was supposed to be with him, but at the last minute, my daughter needed my wife and I at school for a meeting with her teachers. The last time I saw my twin, he had a broad smile on his face, saying he could handle the trip to Memphis and that I needed to make sure that girl was doing okay in school. He missed a gear while pulling out of the shed, and I laughed. At 3:30 that afternoon, I had a jolt of panic run through my soul. I knew something was wrong and that my brother was in trouble. 4 hours later, we got the news that a drunk driver crossed the lane on Highway 78 and hit my brother head on. The truck he drove was 4 feet higher than the sedan driven by the drunk, but the impact jarred his body so that he didn't survive. The hospital told us if he wasn't killed instantly, he did not suffer more than a few minutes. It was not much consolation, but it was something. He was buried 2 days later. Now I could grieve. Half of me was gone, and I didn't know how to go on with the work he and I had started. I didn't know north from south, up from down, or left from right. For a week, I was in a haze. I was a mess, but I eventually got moving. And with some help from my young son and nephew, we got the beans in. There was still a lot to do, but we were over the hump. I checked in on my brother's wife morning and evening, making sure they had everything they needed. I was now her keeper until and if she moved on. And she never moved on. She still lives in the house they built together, and she didn't remarry. It was a month after the funeral, nice spring evening with an exploding orange sunset, when I walked over for my evening check on my sister-in-law. She waved me in the back door into the kitchen. In front of her on the table were all the papers of their lives. Birth certificates, marriage license, property deeds, and truck titles lay there. "I'm going through our papers to see if there are name changes I need to make for you and I," she said. "Leave it alone for now," I said. "No, we need to get all this out of the way. I'm fine to do it. And look, this is yours." She handed me a black and white composition notebook. "Your brother told me to give this to you only in the event of his death. I don't know what it is. He wrote it 20 years ago. It took him all week to write it. It was the strangest week I ever spent with the man. I've never opened the cover, though. Now it's in your hands." And I nodded and took the book. We discussed an item on the table, and then I left. The notebook felt heavy in my hand like an anvil. What had my brother written to me? It was obviously a serious matter. We talked every day of our lives. He could have told me any time he wanted. No secrets were kept. Thoughts ran through my mind like mad. Things like, did he have a child somewhere none of us knew about? Was there another woman in the picture? Had he robbed a bank? I knew none of that was it. I knew the man better than anyone. If he had had those thoughts through the years, I would have too. Whatever it was, it would have to wait until the morning. It was late and I was beat from the day, and I knew this needed fresh eyes to read. Before bed, I placed the notebook in my sock drawer, and turned the lights out, and kissed my wife's cheek, and I tried to sleep. I carried the little notebook to the tractor shed way before my alarm woke us. It wouldn't be daylight for 2 hours. Under the light of a wicked lantern, I sat in a lawn chair where my brother and I would discuss business at the end of the day, and I read the words he had written 22 years before. Immediately I knew that this was not a goodbye letter. He was giving me the details of the day he killed the beast in the woods. Flipping to the last page with marks on it, I read the last paragraph. He was still writing about that day. I needed to make sure there were no surprises coming at the end. I'm that way. And I was relieved not to find out that my brother was admitting to something nefarious or embarrassing to his family. He began the letter by reminding me of the ghosts we had seen in the fields while we worked. During spring, through the heat of the summer, and into the fall at harvest season, we would see shadows in the trees as we planted, cultivated, and brought in our crops. Dark figures, like ghosts, would come in and out of our view. They seemed transparent. We could see limbs and leaves on the other side of them as they moved. This seldom happened, but I recall seeing flashes of dark figures darting out into the fresh dirt behind the tractor, like coyotes do catching rats and mice as we destroyed their homes. It happened so fast that I blamed it on the angle of the light, but deep down I knew something was there. We talked about it with great wonder and called them woods ghosts. Civil War battles were fought near our home, but none on our land as far as we knew. My brother said they were fairies living in the woods. I never dismissed the idea. I think that could be true, but they never showed themselves fully. To me, they could have been shadows we mistook for something alive or dead. I never gave it much thought or tried to figure it out, but I enjoyed seeing them when it became apparent they weren't wild animals there to attack us. Until this day, I wrote the sightings off as shadows. Now I knew what they were, and with my mind now in tune with his, after weeks of him being absent from my life, the next pages were framed so that I understood, and I read on. My brother climbed in his stand that morning before light. It was a permanent stand he built with scrap wood. Quite comfortable, with a roof, chairs, and shelf for his gear, and a shooting port covering almost 360 degrees. I was forced to sit in it when it was completed. He bragged and bragged on how it was the latest thing. No other hunters in the area had a shooting house like this. In my mind, I rolled my eyes, wondering why he climbed in this thing to freeze his ass off, wait on animals to walk by so he could kill them. I was invited every year. He offered to build me one or expand this one so we could hunt together. But hunting deer was not an interest to me, one of the few hobbies we didn't share. He's dead and gone now, many years, and I still don't regret sitting in that stand wasting a good Sunday. I should probably feel a tinge of guilt for missing those times with my brother. I don't. Never regretted it. I watched football on the TV while he did his thing. After settling into his shooting house 15 feet above the ground, he poured coffee from his thermos. At some point he fell asleep. A noise startled him awake. No way to know how long he had been asleep. It was still dark. The sound was half buried as a dream and still half audible in his ear. Something had made a strange noise, an unnatural noise. There must have been enough light, or maybe his eyes had adjusted to the dark so that they were collecting moonlight, because he saw the shadows moving in the darkness. Strange movements by sometimes transparent and sometimes opaque figures moving effortlessly below him. One moved up a bank several feet from the ditch and then stood motionless beside a tree. Another seemed to crawl in the leaves slowly down the bank and then blended in with a large stump, invisible now. Still another, smaller in size, scurried under his stand and was quickly out of view. Up to this point he counted 5, maybe 6. There was no sound, even though their movements should have scattered leaves. He was watching the fairies flitter through the woods, almost as if they hovered over the ground. He was so awestruck that he never thought about the deer he was hunting. This show was better than any buck deer. For several minutes he watched the ghosts and noted that they seemed busy moving back and forth from one location to the next and then back again where they became invisible. While they moved, he could see them. When they stopped, he was alone again in the woods. There was a common posture among the shadows, though he could only make out the direction they faced by the forward movement of their bodies. There appeared to be a routine, and then it hit him. They were looking over the ditch bank for something, like children hiding from their parents. They scurried up the bank, blended with the darkness of the tree trunks, becoming motionless and invisible, only to retreat down the bank to blend in with something else. One after another, they made the same movements, as if a leader was sending them one at a time to look for the enemy. That was it. They were hiding from something or someone. He hoped it was a paternal figure looking for them, and these things were only playing games. But that hope was dashed when the sound that woke him only minutes before ruptured the silence of the forest again. My brother jumped at the noise, kicking his thermos. A thud of metal against wood disrupted the silence, and as if the distraction would never end, it rolled to the wall with a clang, and then teetered out of the access door, fell, hitting several rungs of the ladder until it came to a stop in the dry leaves below. I can see him now, staring down at the heavy green Stanley thermos that revealed his presence, amazed at his luck. Outside the shooting port, and with my brother not paying attention, a massive beast rose full height above the bank of the ditch. When he looked back to the action in front of him, the enchanted sense he had before was now turned to terror. A stone's throw away stood the king of the forest he never knew existed, and it had its eyes trained on my brother. In his notebook, he doesn't give me the distance, but I know it was less than 50 yards. Things were now in motion and would alter his belief system forever. In a flash of movement, the shadows moved quickly from their invisible hides. My brother was surely expecting them to flee the area, but they did the opposite. Within a few seconds, now in the early morning rays of the sun filtering through the leafless trees, as many as 10 now opaque invisible creatures similar to the giant, but not the same, surrounded the base of the shooting house. They faced outward in a tight defensive position. I know my brother, and I have no doubt it took him a minute to gather his thoughts and see what was happening, but he soon realized the creatures below were protecting him from the much different monster slowly walking down into the gully. When King Kong broached the near side ditch bank, the largest of my brother's protectors charged the giant beast. Apparently, the sounds of that fight moved or horrified my brother more than the damage inflicted on the brave beast that stood his ground. But soon it lay unmoving on the forest floor, broken and dead. The males left in the group below him tightened their spacing and formed a front like a Roman legion wedge, anxious to plow down any obstacle in their way. My brother knew they had no chance at stopping this thing. He admired their bravery, but he had to intervene. There was no doubt the giant was coming for him first, and the brave defenders were no match. A small shadow leapt from a female's back and crawled through the defensive wall of the smaller males. Before any of them could stop the youth, it was leaping at the giant with teeth bared. It only took my brother a few seconds to acquire the monster's head and his iron sights, flip the gun from safety to hot, and pull the trigger. He was a good shot, and I bet he knew exactly where the bullet would hit when the recoil jolted his shoulder. The beast dropped to the ground instantly, the young animal now attacking it with ferocious tenacity. So much so that one of the males had to physically remove the young creature from the beast. For a second, all was quiet. Only the ringing remained in my brother's ears, except for the gasp and movement of the monster on the ground. He had instinctively ejected the spent .30-06 brass from his old rifle and had another round ready. Taking aim, he watched, expecting the beast to rise again, but it never did. its massive arm raised in a beckoning motion as if it was telling my brother to come closer so it could get its hands on him. And then its chest rattled, its raised arm fell lifeless to the leaves, and it was dead. The creatures below him moved slowly to the beast to see better. A chatter or discussion began between them in an unknown language. The young animal that so bravely attacked the king had to be held back as it snarled and slobbered at the giant on the ground. Its adrenaline still pumping, the little killer wanted to inflict more punishment. It finally calmed when its mother scolded it, and it submissively crawled onto her back. My brother reluctantly climbed down the ladder. Not knowing how the creatures in front of him would react, a prudent move would have been to have his rifle ready, but he had a hunch it would be okay. Plus, he didn't want them to misinterpret his intentions and think the rifle was meant for them. He was right to approach them unarmed. As he moved closer to the dead animals and the spectators, they began to scatter slowly, giving him plenty of room. Throughout the day, none of them came within arm's reach of my brother. Two of the remaining males lifted their dead comrade from the ground and disappeared into the woods, leaving no less than 7 ghosts at the scene. By now the crowd was far away, but still at a distance they could see what my brother did next. Reading from his notebook, it was not clear how long he stayed inspecting the giant that he killed. My guess is that it was not too long. However, before he left for the house, he communicated to the ghost that they were not to move the dead creature. He didn't know how or why, but somehow they understood. Either his message was clear to them, or they never intended to remove the corpse because the next day when he returned, the giant was still there. The beast lay flat on the ground. My brother ran the tractor close to the corpse and began digging a hole deep, wide, and long, with the backhoe attached to the rear. He wrote that he was worried the tractor wouldn't be enough to lift and move the dead body to another location. This was as good a place as any to bury this thing. As the diesel bellowed coal into the sky, the shadows began to emerge from the woods. The first seemed to slither into place and lean against a large oak trunk. When it stopped moving, he couldn't see it clearly. Before he had dug a foot of soil from the ground, no less than 10 shadows circled the tractor. He had spectators while he worked. Once he saw the hole was large enough to accommodate the creature, he hooked a chain around its midsection and dragged it into the hole. It hit the bottom of the hole, face down. The shadows, mostly invisible throughout the job, began to move from their concealed hides. All at once they surrounded the tractor and the new grave. My brother killed the machine and all was silent, turning his head and body so that he could see them all, and never saying a word, he got his first and only detailed look at the creatures. They were not shadows at all. They were animals with detailed features unlike animals he knew, covered in dark hair, skin a pasty gray, and heads that looked too small for their large frames. There was no way to know how long he waited to finish burying the beast in the hole, but knowing my brother, he spent a while watching and taking it all in. It must have been an enchanted day for him, seeing the fairies he marveled at in previous years. At some point, he started the tractor again after the largest of the shadows motioned for him to resume filling the hole. And in his notebook, he said the shadow, the one he suspected was the patriarch of the group, began kicking dirt into the hole. It was a language he surely understood. He filled the hole quickly and left no marker to identify the location of the grave. The shadows retreated into the woods as silent as they had approached. To my knowledge, he never saw them again this clear. Maybe he did, never told me. But the visions of those creatures remained the same as before while we worked the ground on our land for many years after. just shadows coming in and out of view, never fully revealing themselves, igniting our imaginations to what they must have been. Now I know it was only me wondering what they were. My brother knew the whole time. 2 weeks after burying the monster, he placed this notebook in the bank box and he never talked about it again. It is 20 years from the day that I opened this notebook and 20 years to guess at why he kept all this a secret from even his twin brother. He either kept this to himself because he thought we would have him committed. Maybe he feared he had killed an animal that would bring legal repercussions. I think he wanted to protect them from the public, and that is what he asked me to do at the end. Keep it quiet. Don't tell anyone. And if you do, he wrote, people will show up and try to kill him. And I think he was right. Now you might ask, why are you breaking that promise now? It's because they are not here now. They stayed as they had always been for 20 years after my brother left us. But during the fall of 2019, as we gathered the crops from the field, I never saw them. We pulled our beans in last week trying to beat the rain forecast for next week. We made it, and they're all stored. And at age 78, I still help with the work, mainly because I like to look for the shadows. There's a connection there with my brother. I believe they've moved on, migrated maybe, to a place where food can be found. Much of the land around us has been cleared and some developed. It pushed them out. Maybe they'll come back, even if they are in smaller numbers. My brother would want that. At any rate, I never saw a single shadow as we pulled in our crops last week. To end his letter to me were instructions and a warning. First, he told me the location of the grave. Of course, I knew where his stand was located. I'd never been the man who sits by to leave something like this lie, so I drove the backhoe down into the woods where his stand was. It's now rotten to the ground and eaten by termites. The stand is no longer visible unless you know what to look for. I kicked around the base of the now giant oak tree where he had placed his shooting house, and something solid emerged from the thick bed of leaves. It was his old Stanley thermos. I tried to open it, but the rust forbid me from breaking in. I bet his coffee was still inside. I wanted to see if it was still hot. The Stanley Thermos Company would put me in a commercial if that was true. Other items were scattered about, nothing worth saving, and then I looked over the ground and saw the raised area where I thought he may have buried that thing. Nothing grew there. I thought it strange that where every imaginable vine and briar grew, there was a perfect rectangle on the surface, and it was barren and apparently sterilized. Well, that's where I began to dig. I had scarcely scratched the surface when I saw movement in my peripheral. A shadow moved silent and stealthily to a copse of saplings and remained while I dug the hole. By the time I was finished, 10 to 12 appeared and disappeared, coming in and out of my line of sight. They were moving back and forth from tree to tree, large and small, fast and slow. They watched. I knew the hole was deep from his letter. I would guess it to be 8 feet deep, but I didn't know. But now at that depth, I killed the engine, stepped to the edge of the hole and looked in. Just dirt in the bottom. Lowering the ladder I brought with me into the hole, I crawled down with a shovel. The day was warming, so I shed my outer shirt and flipped it into the dirt pile above. When I looked up, 2 shadows stood above me, and they watched. I began to dig and immediately hit something solid. With enough dirt out of the way, I could see bone. The biggest bone I had ever seen from an animal in this region. It was the monster's thigh bone, every bit of 4 inches in diameter. I located the knee bone, letting me know which way to go for the skull, which is all I wanted to see. I worked it free from the dirt and the neck bone, and I had a time lifting it to clean it off. It weighed as much as a bowling ball, and it was as big as a basketball. I smoothed the dirt from the eye sockets and mouth, shook the loose dirt from the brain cavity, and then sat it on the edge of the hole and climbed out. In all the years I had observed the shadows, I never heard a noise from them, nor did I in years later. But when I laid that skull where they could see it, the chatter started. It was a sound of horror and alarm. Now standing at the edge of the grave, I saw females rush the young away, and the males, while they stayed, moved back from the area, getting distance between them and the beast that they feared. Other than the size of this thing, the shape was like nothing I had ever seen, even in my encyclopedias. The brow was heavy and low on the forehead. A softball would have fit through the eye sockets. Its muzzle protruded unnaturally from its face, and the mouth was lined with massive canines on top and bottom, with a sharp row of teeth in between that strangely resembled shark teeth but were positioned square in the mouth. Only half the jaw and upper left facial bones remained. I figured my brother had hit this thing in the face with his deer cannon. I had seen enough, and I had upset my visitors plenty by removing the skull. I dropped it back in the hole, climbed on the backhoe, and began refilling the grave. My company returned quickly. 2 males threw sticks into the hole violently, as if to tell this thing to stay where it was. I covered it all back up in the next few minutes. The natives settled and observed my exit from the area. For a second, the thought passed through my mind to keep the skull, but I could not find a purpose in that. I suppose it would have been natural for anyone to have these thoughts. Notoriety, maybe fame would follow, but that wasn't my style, nor was it my brother's. I drove the tractor home with a peaceful sense about the day and with a small dread. I wondered where that thing came from. It was in no way similar to the shadow people, neither in size nor in features, other than it appeared to have walked upright like the others, but that is where the similarities stopped. It was a mutant creature from a place we may never know. Maybe it was from hell, which leads to my brother's warning to watch for these things. He wrote that if one appeared, another could follow someday, and for me and our people to remain vigilant, and that if we found ourselves with one of these things nearby, it could be killed with a single shot to the head. He knew because he had done it. That is my brother's story. I know it seems strange. I still have a hard time with it, but I'm at the end of my life, and I wanted someone to know about my brother and the clan of shadows that he saved on that fall day in 1977.